As the world emerges from its various lockdowns, governments and countries are waiting for their economy to recover after coming out from 2, maybe even 3 months of lockdown. But yet we are seeing multiple and continuous reports about retrenchments happening globally. Now in Singapore, experts are estimating job losses that go up to 150,000 to 200,000, with potentially even negative GDP of up to 6%. You also see that Straits Times reported that in April alone, more than 8,600 businesses ceased operations in Singapore. And in fact, experts are warning that a lot more of these companies are going to go under. Now, what you see over here is Singapore's birth chart. So just like individuals, you'll find that even countries have birth charts. This chart is cast for the 9th of August, 1965, on the exact day of Singapore's Declaration of Independence. It is cast for 10 a.m., which was the exact time that the radio broadcast went out to declare Singapore an independent country. So you see that actually Singapore was not very affected in the February to March period. What you see on this screen here is I've cleared off all the other planets save for just one chart indicator, a very minor one, that was affected in Singapore during February to March, which means, well, if you think about it, not much actually happened during that period, short of us declaring DORSCON orange. However, you'll see that during the period of April to July, situations have changed drastically. What you see on this diagram is the Venus retrograde that's transiting in the sky at the moment is affecting up to 6 major chart indicators in Singapore. It is one of the reasons why Singapore is much more affected from April onwards. And if you can see here, there are some of these keywords give us some clues as to what we may expect in Singapore during this period, including difficult decisions by the authorities, not just the government, but various other authorities with regard to rules and regulations as well. We've definitely seen social distancing get extended multiple times during this period as circuit breaker was extended once, with our emergence being broken down into various stages rather than a one-shot lifting. You also find that things like financial and material loss is affecting this country, not just on a company-by-company basis, but also to the country as a whole. We also see work reductions, with companies reporting a decrease of work capacity down to up to 20% of the normal work capacity. We also see death and victims. So death is in inverted commas because it doesn't necessarily mean people actually physically dying, but rather these deaths may also refer to metaphorical endings of companies as well as various industry activities going on at the same time. We also see work casualties as well as health getting affected, especially as we see COVID numbers start to climb very rapidly from about April onwards. Now, going into the timeline for 2020, I would like to highlight 2 very big threats which we can see right now from astrological calculations. Now, I'm going to explain them one after the other. Now, the first one is called a violent T-square. So on this screen, you'll see the red T over there. I've already circled a couple of planets down here on right at the bottom of the chart, known as the 4th house. And we're going to begin with the transit of Pluto. The Chinese refer to Pluto as Yan Luo Wang, which is the king of the underworld. So I've put in here some English words that interpret this in English, which means underlying foundational problems. This timeline shows that the effect of Pluto may have kicked in from as early as February 2019. So which is not February of this year, the COVID-19 year, but actually February of the previous year. So you also want to pay attention to the red arrow that begins in late April, which indicates that potentially some of these foundational problems which may have shown its head early last year may start to exacerbate around about this year. And you can see that, in fact, from as early as last year in Q1, Ministry of Trade and Industry had already started putting out some of these downbeat forecasts. And as you can see here, the headline actually says that this is the lowest GDP growth in almost a decade. What this means is that GDP in Singapore has been falling fairly constantly for almost 10 years now. And in fact, you can see from the article, it says here, MTI has noted that the global growth outlook has weakened further since February. So the cracks have begun to show up. But this year, just barely a month and a half ago, Fitch Ratings has placed our Singapore banks on rating watch negative, based on the kind of exposure to some of the liabilities, especially now with the coronavirus situation. As you can see here, the date here says 29th of April. So that means any kind of foundational issues are starting to be observed and noticed by external parties such as Fitch Ratings. I also want to point out that as Jupiter, it's the planet that is in grey, is transiting the 4th house, we call this if I were to interpret this into English, I've put here as protective measures to secure strength. So while last year you may have found not a lot of measures were kicking in to sort of deal with this situation, this year the situation has changed, partially because of the more intense effect of the coronavirus in Singapore's economy. You see from the timeline here, and please focus on the red areas, from as early as middle of March, that a lot of these protective measures start to kick in. The red arrow begins from May, which is just about early last month. So how have we seen this playing out in Singapore so far? Of course, most of us remember some of the stimulus packages. In fact, a trio of stimulus packages that showed up between February to April just a few months ago. So we've stated here we had the small one in February, and of course another small one in April, but the big one at $48 billion that got the world to sit up. This happened in March, just where the protective measures, the Jupiter transit, had kicked in into Singapore's chart. Of course, when it comes down to the red arrow, where the retrograde period started in May, and in fact, we've just seen the government put out our 4th stimulus package, and this one is also a hefty one at $33 billion, bringing the total amount of our stimulus packages to almost $100 billion. And this shows that the Singapore government is taking this situation very, very seriously, and a lot of these are just the protective measures that are kicking in from the coronavirus situation. We have one more corner of the T-square. We call this Mars hitting Mars in an opposition. So as Mars is crossing through the number 7th house, we should expect a lot of external problems outside of Singapore that may serve as a tipping point to expose any kind of our internal weaknesses and potentially a collapse. This article shows just a mere example of some of the world's financial problems which could very easily affect an island country like Singapore. This is one of a multitude of articles warning about world global debt crisis that is easily mounting right now by the day. What I've done here is I've put the Mars timeline onto the Singapore timeline, and you can see in the red blocks actually start beginning from the middle of August. And of course, we don't have articles yet because August is yet to come. But what we're expecting is that the plummet, the tipping point may just hit just about the middle part of August, right after National Day. Now, the second big threat that Singapore is expected to experience this year, I call this a chaotic Uranus 8th house ingress. I know that's a lot of astrology terms, but let me explain this in simple languages. Okay, so this diagram shows you what we mean when Uranus, which is the blue planet, that is crossing into the 8th house. Now, in order to explain what we can expect this year when Uranus makes that ingress, let's go back to history. And you'll see that from as far back as 15 years ago in 2005, Uranus had actually made an ingress into the 6th house. So this diagram here shows that this interprets as chaos to health. Now, some of you may recall that in 2005, Singapore had a dengue outbreak. So this prior to SARS, prior to COVID-19, we had the dengue outbreak in 2005. And in fact, the number of deaths was 27. So this was quite a major event at the time in Singapore. So if I were to bring back this diagram to show you Uranus crossing to the 6th house, you may notice that the ingress happens exactly at 7 Pisces. I've also shown you a short screenshot here of the record of the exact positioning of Uranus, and you'll see that it's exactly on 7 degrees specifically in the months of September and October of 2005. And you can see here in the Wikipedia article that the dengue situation in Singapore actually peaked, which means it was at its worst in September and October of 2005, which corresponds exactly to when Uranus is sitting specifically on this line. Now, if, a further example occurred here in 2013 all the way to the early part of 2014. Okay, so if I were to interpret this into English, Uranus ingressing the 7th house refers to chaos between the government and its people. Typically, we would expect things like protests, unrest, disagreements, and these are words that we seldom associate with peace-loving Singaporeans who do not have a protest and a riot culture. However, 2013 was an unusual year that saw Singapore thronging Hong Lim Park in the thousands, right, for what we now know as the White Paper protests. Some of you may recall a lot of the newspaper articles involving characters like Han Hui Hui or Roy Ngung and a couple of other prominent figures at the time. This was also the year that we saw the Free My Internet protests against an MDA rule. We also saw a record pink dot protest with more than 21,000 people thronging Hong Lim Park in pink T-shirts for the lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender cause. This was the year that ended with the Little India riots. Now, photographs like this is what we associate with other countries or with with violence or riots, but almost never with Singapore. So this was the year with the Little India riots. So again, astrology was accurate in predicting that 2013 was going to be a year of protests. Now, why we are covering this is because this year, in July, Uranus is going to make yet another ingress. And some of the keywords here are this is what we can expect in July this year, that we can expect chaos in areas involving investments, foreign finances, the stock market, tax revenue, banking, insurance, CPF, and crisis. So in fact, we actually, based on previous calculations for when the exact dates for when Uranus is crossing that line happens to be the 10th of Taurus. And as you can see here, this begins from as early as the 5th of July 2020, which is just about less than a month from now. And it will last all the way throughout August. And you can see here that as it moves from white color to gray color, this is in astrological terms, we call this a retrograde. So we should expect the situation to exacerbate further from the middle of August, specifically from the 14th, 15th of August onwards, and it will last all the way for the most part of September. So what I've included this timeline onto the earlier timelines for the T-square, and if you pay attention to the red portion, the red blocks, which will last between July to September, this is exactly what I've just shown you, is when we expect a lot of these crises that comes out in matters involving Singapore's financial markets. This also coincides with the timeline I put out earlier for the tipping point for when Singapore's financial markets may be most affected. And in conclusion, what you see here is that Singapore could be a house of cards in the coming months, and already the storm is gathering above us. And all it will take is just a breeze in order to turn this house of cards down. Now, the only thing is, at this point, the authorities are trying to glue the cards together. And by this, I'm not just talking about the government. We're talking about lots of business leaders, organization leaders are trying to keep this whole setup together as of now. However, there's a very big problem in the sense that many of them do not actually understand what is happening with all the strange phenomena that 2020 is turning out to be. Also, many of them cannot answer what is going to happen next. And for many of you, the question that is foremost on your mind is, what can I do next? And it's possible that many of them may not have the answers to give you. And yet, astrology has the answers. Now that we know what to expect in the upcoming months, the number one question on our minds should be, what can I do to prepare? Now, I run a series of monthly live online events in which I share timely and updated astrological forecasts, as well as how to pivot and transit into the new economy. So put yourself on our watch list so that you can gain yourself priority access onto all my events. Join me on my next webinar.